Hi, my name is Marcus, and this is a companion podcast for the CG Jung Helpdesk meetup group. I host live events on Zoom every 2 weeks about the concepts and ideas of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Every event I give a presentation about the Jungian concept, so have fun with this event's topic.
Recording in progress, that's perfect. And I want to welcome you to a very special topic, which is very obscure and which is fitting to the stage where I am at with this group, since I've done an introductory course into Jung with the first, I think, 28 episodes or something like that. And I want to go into the pretty cool stuff and pretty unknown stuff. And this topic is pretty unknown, except for some. And it's about Puer Aeternus, which is an archetype. Talked about archetypes before in a general sense, what Jung understood of archetypes as this pattern of behavior that exists in the collective unconscious, which means in the human nature of us, and can come out under special circumstances and influence one's life. So Jung has a very famous quote, which is, unless you make the unconscious conscious, it will dictate your life and you will call it fate. And this all sounds very abstract, like a pattern of behavior and unconscious contents and fate and all these things. So here I have an example of this idea from Jung that you have an archetype taking over the life of a person and playing out a kind of mini drama. This is how he explained archetypes, that it's a more sophisticated version of an instinct. An instinct is something that you do instinctual, like reacting when there's a loud noise, that you shrug or twitch. And these things people know very often, but an archetype is sneaky in that sense. It happens over such a long time that you might not be aware of this happening. So, Puer Aeternus, what does it mean? What is the definition? And it is a Latin term called the eternal boy. And there's a quote from Jung. The Puer Aeternus has all the qualities of the adolescent psychology, all that hopeful one-sidedness, that hopeful attempt. Aeternus is nothing but life, life in blind spreading form, full of conflict, full of worry, full of nonsense. And you have the feelings of the extraordinary uprush of the life symbolized by the Puer Aeternus. So it is childlike, but already adolescent in the sense of adventurous, full of energy, turning outward, but also being naive, stumbling, doing things maybe in a stupidly manner. And Jung sets it in the context of other big archetypes that we have, as, for example, the wise old man or the earth mother or the shadow and the anima and the animus, and all those figures that are represented in a certain way. Jung makes a distinction between the archetype, the pattern itself, and the manifestation of the pattern. Like the wise old man is the pattern, but the manifestation then, for example, is Gandalf or Obi-Wan Kenobi or one's grandfather or maybe one's coach or best friend or someone being that represented and living out this archetype. So the Puer Aeternus is the pattern, but it's also manifesting in different ways. Jung saw this really when you have, for example, Dionysus, the Greek god, who comes to the world and immediately starts to play tricks, for example, like Hermes, and influences people to do a lot of stupid things, especially Dionysus associated with partying and getting drunk, influencing then people. So how would that look like when somebody is then caught by this archetype? And there was something that Stephen said before. It is this infantile nature that comes up. So it is a way of operating, it's a way of being in the world and existing and seeing the world, but again, one-sided. It's okay to be an adolescent, but it's not okay to be only an adolescent and looking at the world only through that lens. This needs to be separated from another archetype that Jung has for children, which is a divine child and basically baby Jesus. That is a manifestation of the beginning individuation process of a person, pops up in dreams, which also has its own essay by Jung, which I read and actually talks very little about that. So we have something else. We have the enterprising young adult that is in the world, wants to establish, and is full of Sturm und Drang, and wants to do something, wants to be adventurous. How can this archetype come up? And this is a very interesting thing, because we're talking of Jung, we're talking of staples that he always talks about, and one is compensation. That means when the consciousness is configured in a certain way, which is, again, one-sided, which is typical for consciousness, the opposite be constellated in the unconscious. Which means when somebody is extremely serious, extremely adult, and very much, let's say, adapted to their environment, they're very collective. They're just following the rules of society, rules of the family, rules of the relationship that they're in with their partner. There's something constellated in their unconscious that tries to bring them to the other side. And this side for Jung is the Puer Aeternus. So the missing qualities that a person is not exhibiting in their waking life, in their just being in the world, will be in the unconscious and will be pushed against consciousness to bring the person and with their psychology back into balance. And the best way to see this and to become aware of this is for Jung dreams, because dreams are the direct access to the unconscious. It's a kind of unfiltered stream of unconscious contents getting into contact with consciousness. Because when you sleep and you lie down, you close your eyes, things get dark, your level of consciousness gets so low that you become surrounded by your own unconscious psychology. So all the things that are coming from the unconscious and being represented in dreams have for Jung a meaning. And Jung says the unconscious is always reacting to the things that are happening in consciousness. So when a person is being a certain way in their waking life, the unconscious will constellate there the other part. And it will be manifested through dream images, dream experiences. And I have a quote for that. If the unconscious attitude is too infantile, too immature, an old woman appears as a compensation figure. And the wise old man always appears when one is too foolish. Then, the moment one becomes mature and reasonable in one's attitude, infantile figures turn up in dreams. The Puer Aeternus motif, for instance. You see, when one is old in one's consciousness, perhaps too reasonable, too adapted, too considerate, then one's soul is young. It is a child even, because one needs childlikeness and honor not to dry up and suffocate in one's own wonderful adaptation. So this is something to look out for. In dreams, what are the kind of figures that get encountered? Because the interesting thing is, when you have figures in the unconscious, it is never something separated from oneself. It's one's own psyche, it's one's own unconscious. It is a representation of a part of oneself, and very likely a part that is separated. It's so separated that it's being experienced as a separate entity. And especially the ones that are manifested as human beings have the possibility to be interacted with. When you dream of an animal or just a situation that's very hard to interact with, but with a human being, you can build a relationship, you can talk. And this is something you also said, if we switch over to the divine child, that very often then in the dreams, the children are very smart. They're in their mind like an adult, and you can talk to them. And this is also an experience that I had, which was really weird. But basically, you have a small baby and can talk like with an adult with a baby. So you have the compensating figure, and your consciousness is too adapted. So this means the Puer Aeternus archetype gets activated to bring the person back into balance. What can happen if the relationship is not built up in a sensible way? Compensation really tries to bring the person back in the middle. That means if the person stays in this adapted state, in this one-sided state, the other side will get stronger and stronger and stronger and push. And if it gets ignored completely, this can result in a possession, which means the archetype basically takes over the body and the being of the person, also in waking life. This can happen voluntarily and involuntarily. Voluntarily would be then a kind of identification to say like, oh yeah, I'm now really this free-floating spirit that came up from my unconscious. So the awareness would be missing that it's actually something that is separated, something impersonal that needs to be integrated, but then rather it's lived out completely. So we have it then in the unconscious. And of course, what can also happen is when a person is just too infantile in general. This means, of course, everybody's growing up as first a child and has the psychology of a child. But this, of course, needs to change. And this needs to adapt to the circumstances, to become collective in a sense, to be adapted to the outside world. But of course, someone cannot stay there. And this is what Freud dealt with. Bring people out of their family psychology, because when you are in the psychology of your surrounding, just stay there. You do not develop. And this is super interesting that a lot of, for example, romance literature for women is about being taken away by a strange man into a new world or into the world, basically being kidnapped. And a lot of fairy tales are like that. A lot of movies are like that. But this is, of course, not only true for women, it's also true for men to go out, experience the world, and establish one own. Of course, if one does not do that, shirks away from the responsibility, they become neurotic. And there I have another quote for that, for this infantilism. It is not possible to live too long amid infantile surroundings or at the bosom of the family without endangering one's psychic health. Life calls forth to independence, and anyone who dares not to heed this call because of childish laziness or timidity is threatened with a neurosis. Because this is always the result when there's a disbalance in the psyche, when there's forces acting against one each other. It's a neurosis. So the person cannot act out their normal life until they have resolved this problem. Very often, neurosis is the reason why people go into therapy. But Jung says this can be observed earlier already in their dreams. Of course, it's hard to understand what's in the dreams because this is always the part that one does not know and does not recognize. This is why it's in the unconscious. But if one would record it and look at it afterwards, would see like, oh, there were already all these breadcrumbs coming up that pointed into a certain direction of development. And Jung mentions one very famous example of a Puer Aeternus, and that's from literature. And this is The Little Prince by a French author. And this is very famous, especially by women. So my wife likes The Little Prince a lot, but like in general, it's very famous. It seems like Jung had some inside information about the author because he said, oh, it's a pretty clear sign of a mother complex. From first-hand information, he knows that this is the case. So, Puer Aeternus, you have it. You're infantile in your psychology. That can be, of course, in your lived out psychology, but also in your unconscious already constellating over there. What helps basically against it? And Jung has a pretty clear answer for that. And he says it has to be the anima. There has to be the female component because the Puer Aeternus is completely masculine. It's a completely masculine psychology. And to break up the masculine psychology, it means the female psychology, which is characterized and also then manifested through the anima. And here again, it's this point where you say, okay, yeah, this sounds all very abstract, but what would it look like? And one example is just at what point do adolescent boys break away from their endeavoring, bashful way of being? It's when they get a girlfriend. It's when they get into a relationship. And there's a lot of stories and there's just a lot of movies about that. You can see it, for example, in Lion King, where you have Simba that get cast out as the small child, but is then in this friendship group of Timon and Pumbaa. And he's being this bashful, naive, easygoing, lazy guy, just living into the day. When Nala comes around and says like, okay, there's responsibility. You have to get back and you have to get going. And this is when he then leaves this group of people. Or there's another movie called Superbad. So you have it in a lot of teenage movies or about teenagers, that it is this change of relationship between these boy groups through, of course, of the female element getting in because that's the future, this is the development, and how their psychological needs change and need to adapt. And it's again always so interesting that Jung writes about these things. And for me, it's always, I have it in the back of my mind. And then I see something and say, oh, yeah, this is what Jung meant. This is the example. Because at the same time, this is very often how Jung approaches the things. He looks into the world, he sees certain things. Of course, he did not see Lion King or Superbad, but there's some archetypal things in it because it is a story and because it's famous. So he saw it in other places, and he tried to condense it down and psychologize it with some statement like, okay, yeah, the Puer Aeternus is mitigated by the anima. Without the anima, there's only this bashful youthness and this naivety and one-sidedness and a little bit also of carelessness. I have also another story which I read, which I found very interesting. It is about, in the past, there was this huge LAN parties. So when you have hundreds of people bringing their own PCs and they play games over the local area network in a huge hall. And so it was always guys, of course. And the whole situations changed once girls started to participate also. For example, the guys started to shower. They would not shower for days. But as soon as the women came, they're like, oh yeah, we need to change, we need to adapt something, which is always then funny. And this is what is meant with an archetype. It's just an experience that somehow everybody can see in stories or experience for themselves. And this has happened something so often that it became ingrained in the psychology and in the depth of our collective unconscious. This would be on an individual level, meaning what does it mean for the individual when they are grabbed by infantilism and always something is constellated within them. But Jung would not be Jung if he would not see it in a bigger context. And he puts it in a cultural context also. And this is what makes him very interesting in the sense of he tries not only to see the individual, but rather he tries to see the past, tries to see histories, groups, all these things. This is the main difference between him and Freud. Like Freud does not talk really about culture or groups or history because he breaks everything down and says, oh yeah, religion is a father complex, for example, and art is only because of a mother complex. But Jung talks about psychology of nations, and his example for a nation grabbed by the psychology of a Puer Aeternus, which means a group with its individual members all grabbed by it, is the German nation before the Second World War. And I have some quotes here. The fact that the anima problem only reaches about as far as the Rhine, east of the Rhine, the problem either of the wise old man or the Puer Aeternus comes up. The whole mental revolution in Germany is chiefly an activity of the Puer Aeternus, but there the wise old man is absent. Nietzsche's Zarathustra was an attempt to foresee and to compensate for the danger that this country would fall a victim to the Puer Aeternus, the boy. And Jung talks a lot about Nazi Germany in that sense. He described it as this lot of energy and desire for movement, but not really with a goal, but that everything should be, he described it like that, should be dared, but it was not really clear for what. And he was there, he was in Nazi Germany and had also contact with people there. And there was this one situation where he described from some kind of Nazi rally where you had this huge group of people making a huge swastika with torches and all this horrible stuff. And the guy that organized it turned around to Jung and said, so what do you think? What does it all mean? So not even the guy organizing it knew why they were doing it, but they needed to do it. They had the urge just to do it like that. And this is why he said there was this grip of collective unconscious forces taking over a complete nation. And he sees this in the psychology of Germany at the time, represented by the fact that, for example, when you had a book written in the German language, it was not about the anima. So you had that in France and you had that in Great Britain, that you had a great love, for example, but you did not have it in Germany. In Germany, you very have the books about little boys that basically then killed themselves at the end. And I can confirm this because I had to read those books in school. And he argues that this has a kind of historical reasons, that the psychological development was not as far. It was still in this pubescent stage. I would say the parts of, for example, France were colonized by the Romans earlier. So they had a little bit of a head start against the German nations that got colonized later. So they were already at the anima stage. But east of the River Rhine, it was still the Puer Aeternus stage, whereas the bashful, young, adventurous young man with the Wanderlust and the Sturm und Drang and all these things that German literature is famous for, which is missing on the other side of the Rhine, based on that the Romans could not go much farther than the Rhine as a huge natural barrier. And I have another quote. Masculine psychology, the Puer Aeternus psychology, prevails they're an account of the youth of those tribes. In the older civilization west of the Rhine, the anima problem comes in. But the east of the Rhine, there's generally the problem of the relationship between man and the subordinate principle. An idea on enthusiasm, for instance, or a big enterprise. It is entirely the psychology of the youth who is entering life where the world consists mostly of man. And it's, again, so interesting to think about it. How true could this be? Like, I'm seeing it completely through a Jungian lens by saying, okay, everything that Jung says is basically true and something which should be treated as true when you see it through the lens. But the question is really, okay, yeah, what grips a group, and why is psychology in small as in big? And is it possible that there's a kind of collective spirit taking over and causing horrible things? And this is something that is basically known for thousands of years and has been represented before. This is the thing, that it is nothing new, but rather you have 1,000 of years ago with the young god Dionysus as a small child. And this would normally be the stage where I would conclude this presentation, because this would be the collective wisdom of all the things Puer Aeternus from Jung. But I have to be honest and have to make a confession in the sense of I chose the topic in a sense completely wrong, because I misremembered a story that Jung told, and I thought it was about Puer Aeternus, and I just picked the topic and wrote it as an event, and it was not Puer Aeternus. It was a completely different phenomena that it really did not have a name. So I'm going to talk about this now. I talked about before about dreams, and it was about children, and this is where I confused it, because there's a super interesting story of a patient of Jung that started to have dreams of a child, or not even his child, but the child of his anima. And this was what I found super interesting. It is in the dream seminar, pretty much in the beginning, where Jung gives a multi-year seminar on dreams and how to interpret them, and trying to explain the psychology and how he would interpret them. So a patient came to him and sat down with him and said, okay, I'm kind of stuck in my life. He was 47. And yeah, everything was a little bit played in, the relationship with his wife. He did not have any kids, but he had a sister. And the sister had a baby boy that died pretty young. And it died pretty much 2 years ago. And he started shortly after the boy died in his interest in occult studies, because he was reading an occult book at that time. And he invested a lot of time in that, reading books, trying to investigate it, talking with people. At a certain point, he stopped because he was very, not ordinary, but a very diligent person. He said, oh, at a certain point, it's just nonsense. One should not invest time into that. And Jung had really a hard time to crack him. And so he, in analysis, would talk with the person about their life, their relationships, their hobbies, where do they invest time in, which is a super interesting and super important thing. Where do people invest time and money into when they have time and money? And he talked about how he started to dream of a little girl. And the girl was roughly 2 years old. And Jung says, when you dream of children, the age tells you something about when something started to happen in your psyche at that time. For this example, 2 years ago. So same as a child gets born in a certain point in the external world, when you encounter a child, the age tells you something about something was born inside your psyche that time ago. 7 years, 7 years ago. 2-year-old child, 2 years ago. And this is where he then started to investigate further. And there we got really interested, because it was not his child in his dreams, but rather it was the child of a woman. And the woman was not his wife. And how Jung found out, basically, the guy was incredibly bored by his wife, because they have been married already for a long time. And because he was an upstanding man, he would not really admit it. And he would not admit to a lot of things, especially not his thinking side. So he was very rational, very in his head thinking, which always means that a feeling is in the unconscious, it's in the shadow part, and it's doing a thing there. And this guy was so one-sided and so, let's say, collective in his approach to the world, that his shadow side had a child with his anima. And this was the child he was experiencing. So the story, when you read it, it's amazing. This is why I wanted to talk about it. And his psyche got even so far that the child was sick. And Jung interpreted this as the psyche telling him something was born inside of you when this little boy died of his sister, his nephew, that he buried his feeling inside of him that started to cause havoc in his psyche because he could not admit to certain things. As talked about where you invest time and money. Time and money is always associated with libido, which is psychic energy, which makes things happen. And if you don't let the things that should happen, they will start building up somewhere. And this is then again represented in dreams through persons, for example, or through situations. So his suppressed feeling or not taking care of feeling started to manifest itself in these occult studies because his life was boring, it was ordinary. So he wanted to find out something about the other side, the other world, things that are strange, that are more than how the world is existing as you know it. And this again was suppressed by him through the fact that he was so upstanding and saying, oh, this is nonsense. So it's not that he kind of integrated it or refuted it. He just said, oh, one should stop. This is not a good way to spend one's time. And so it comes up into his unconscious. And he told these stories how his shadow would go to the theater with him and said, like, okay, leave the woman at home with the sick child. Or that the woman would show him the sick child. So he did all these things, let's say, wrong in his waking life, that a whole theater, whole family formed in his psyche. The shadow being represented by his brother, by the way, which was also super interesting. And he would do things with them and living a second life with them. Of course, Jung had to break all this up because it's not a healthy way to be. This is already pretty neurotic. And of course, such a burden to the life of the patient that he could not live his life normally anymore. But I read this and thought this is super interesting, that it is not in a certain way random. This is normally the approach that people have with dreams. Oh, dreams are random. This is random synapses that are firing. If it gets a little bit more sophisticated, then it's like, okay, these are the contents you experience in your daily life, but you are not completely aware of them. And Jung says, okay, there's a series of dreams that dreams are always in the context of each other and they have to be interpreted to each other. But to say that there's a being constellated in your psyche based on its age internally when this problem happened, this blew my mind. Because for Jung, dreams and the unconscious, this is nature. So everything is very much matched. We are adapted with our psychology to nature and natural things happening. The sun going up and down, this is represented in our psychology. Life and death and development of a person, this is in our psychology. And this means all these natural rules are in us, the same as our body is adapted to the outside world, that we can see certain wavelengths, that we can hear certain wavelengths, like that we can synthesize vitamin D with our skin when we are at the sun. Like our body and physiology is adapted to the world, but also our psyche is adapted to that it's matching those patterns in our unconscious up to the point in our dreams that when we dream of little children, that it points to a specific point in time in the past. And this blew my mind. And this is what I wanted to talk about. And I thought, yeah, that's the Puer Aeternus. And then I looked it up and I could find nothing about it in this context, in this story. And then I looked it up and said, oh yeah, he did not give it any name. So, but I wanted to stay true to the content that I promised. And I hope you learned something and heard about something new. And yeah, be wary of children in your dreams. Thank you for paying attention.
This was this event's topic. Thanks for tuning in. During an event, a discussion part follows after the presentation where all attendees discuss the just presented topic or other Jungian concepts. If you also want to join, find the group on meetup.com. The name of the group is CG Jung Helpdesk. Also make sure to subscribe to the podcast on the platform of your choice. See you next time.